The theme of the 2020 Cycle Touring Festival is celebrating cycle touring closer to home. The OysterWheel is a classic example of this idea, a multi-day ride that can be undertaken by any of the 10 million people living inside the London Oyster Card zone simply by staying at home and travelling to the start and end points each day by public transport. Visitors to London can of course cycle it as well, either touring traditionally from point to point, or else using a base in the capital. What you will discover if you undertake it is the glorious views of the green belt around London, made up of woods, hills and rivers, as well as a strong sense of historical place, ranging from Iron Age forts through Norman castles, Tudor palaces, to disused railways and canals. However, rather than spend time describing the route itself, other than brief highlights, what I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes or so is to describe how the OysterWheel was put together, and some of the challenges that I faced in planning it. Hopefully, by highlighting these, it will give you a view of some of the difficulties that you might find in planning a similar route in the UK, and an idea of the potential sources of solutions. So 2019 was the year that myself and my wife were going to tour Europe on our tandem. However, it all fell apart with my wife's pancreatic cancer diagnosis. Suddenly, I found myself in London with time to kill during her chemo sessions, and a lot on my mind. Never had Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's phrase seemed so relevant. I needed a project to keep me occupied, and preferably one with a bike involved, given the dry summer. After an initial long ride on Easter Monday, I decided I'd try to do an orbit of London. However, I struggled to find any documented routes, other than a road marathons trying to circle as close as possible to the M25 in a single day. And that's not really my idea of fun. So I decided to create one for myself. But as someone who has largely previously followed pre-described routes, I underestimated the challenges that I would face. When I set off from Uxbridge that Easter Monday, I wasn't planning a multi-day ride. It was a sunny day, and I had it to myself as one of my friends was visiting her. I'd seen the National Cycle Network routes 6 and 61 heading round from Uxbridge to St Albans and then on to Hertford, and it just looked like a good ride for a fine day. The tracks initially were deserted with the early start, and there was blossom in the trees and bluebells in the woods. Under wheel it was easy going, and I made good time to Hertford, so much so that I carried on heading down the Lee Valley so I could notch up my first 100-kilometre ride. It was only when I got home that I realised I'd cycled almost a quarter of the M25. That gave me an idea for the project I was looking for, the circumnavigation of London. However, when I searched for suggested routes, I was surprised not to find any. So I decided to plan one myself, for which I needed some rules. The first one was important. The start and end each day needed to be accessible by public transport from central London. Also, I'd got used to using Oyster cards to easily get through stations, much simpler than trying to buy tickets whilst holding a bike, so I limited myself to that. That mostly meant trains, although a few tube lines like the Metropolitan also allow bikes. I've also got a basic Trek hybrid bike in London with 38C partially treaded tyres, and I enjoy being out away from traffic, so it meant the route could neither be full of single track nor exclusively on road. I should also use the National Cycle Network as a priority and avoid major roads when it could. Finally, from a practical perspective, I couldn't be riding for more than 5 hours each day, as I had to catch trains at either end and get back to pick up my wife from Bart's hospital. So, full of confidence in my route planning capabilities, I started off trying to plan onward from where I'd left off in the Lee Valley. However, I soon hit problems. As you can see from the map, this part of Essex has very few national routes and a limited number of oyster stations, just Chingford, Shenfield, Upminster, Rainham and Grays, none of which was particularly close to those national routes. I tried to see if I could fill in the holes in National Route 13 between Rainham and Grays, but whilst Rainham marshes were beautiful, I ended up cycling through industrial estates along dual carriageways. I also tried Shenfield to the Tilbury Ferry, but again was unimpressed except for the final section from the Langdon Hills to the Coalhouse Fort on the Thames estuary. Disheartened, I looked at the other side of the estuary and again drew a blank once away from the major routes. I was finding that just drawing a line on a map left too much to chance. I decided to switch focus to Western Kent, where I knew, doing the rides in Jack Thurston's Lost Lanes books, that the roads from Sevenoaks to Hever were quiet and pretty. On checking them against the open cycle map on View Ranger, I noticed a proposed regional route in purple, which took me up the downs from Sevenoaks, round to Chiddingstone via local roads, and then connected up beyond Evenbridge to the Surrey Cycleway. It was an easy job to find the nearest Oyster stations at either end in Knockholt and Caterham. In practice, Knockholt was on the top of the North Downs and Caterham was on the other side of them, so the day was quite physical, but it got me back on track and the views were certainly worth it. Having found the Surrey Cycleway and how well it is signposted, I moved round to the southwest. I had by now decided that my circuit would finish with a climb of Box Hill, and hence Tattenham Corner was set as the start and end points for the whole ride. I just needed a route to get me round to Hampton Court, the only Oyster station in that area. The Surrey Cycleway thankfully made that easy, and it gave me great views from the top of Ranmore Common and a picturesque finish along the River Thames. The next section, round to Uxbridge, seemed easy, as there was a National Cycle Network route all the way, firstly via the Thames Cycleway, which is Route 4, and then using Route 61. It did mean that I had to retrace my steps back to Chertsey, but the Thames route was gentle and had the added value of heading through Windsor Great Park. Challenges happened, of course, on the other side of Windsor. The route's signs suddenly disappeared, and I ended up in the middle of an uncut grassy field, struggling to follow single track across it. Fortunately, the section was only short and I was soon back on course, but it did highlight the variability in the quality of the national network and the need to try out these routes rather than just rely on them on paper. Now I felt I was on a roll and decided to head back to fill in one of the gaps I'd left earlier in Kent. Feeling more positive about the open cycle map, I noticed another proposed route, this time from the Medway Valley to the Darrant Valley. Knowing that I could get back to Knockholt from the Darrant, and noticing the National Cycle route from Dartford to the Medway, I checked it out on the Oven Survey map and found it was both cyclable and ancient. In fact, it was the route of the Pilgrim's Way that used to take pilgrims from Salisbury to Canterbury in the Middle Ages. On the ground, it turned out to be excellent. 20 kilometres of quiet tracks and bridleways that were full of wildflowers and wildlife, but empty of people. So that just left Essex. I took a closer look at the empty spaces in the open cycle map and noticed there were forests, Epping and Hainault. I did some research on the internet and soon was downloading cycle maps published by the local authorities of permitted cycling trails. A search on Komoot also revealed favourite segments mapped by other people, so I had the makings of a route. This was completed by a short Sustands route, 136 down the Inglebourne Valley, and by National Cycle Network 1 to the edge of Epping. Suddenly a problem day had been turned into an off-road extravaganza, cycling through great forests with minimal road sections and a pretty cafe at the end just before Rainham. What more could I want? Well, the answer to that, of course, was a route from Rainham to Dartford. I was expecting to have to plot a zigzag course of minor roads when I noticed NCN 137, all of 3 kilometres long, along the Mardyke Valley. It seemed strange to have such a small national route, so I studied it on the Oven Survey map. Suddenly I noticed that it could be extended along the dyke by a bridleway, potentially the missing link I'd been looking for. I headed off the next day and found a dry grass track bridleway, perfectly cyclable in summer conditions, as you can see on the picture, and it could easily be linked to NCN 13 at either end. Suddenly I was zooming down the coast over the ferry to Gravesend and headed up to Dartford, and I'd linked the pieces together. All that was left was my old favourite of Box Hill. I had to extend my traditional circuit to get to the right length for the day, but even that revealed a hidden gem in the national route to Hawley. Then it was a simple job to follow the Surrey Cycleway around and pedal the steady climb to the top. After celebratory pictures and a cake in the cafe, I headed back to Tattenham Corner and had accomplished my goal. So what did I see? Well, certainly the countryside around London is blessed with many historical and natural sites, and the route passes many of these. It's full of green fields, forests, and beautiful sights. To borrow an idiom from the 12 Days of Christmas, I could summarise this as 12 historical sites, stately homes including the pictured Rainham Hall, but also castles, Norman churches, Tudor hunting lodges and a windmill. 11 major tributaries of the Thames, including the Great River itself, which of course I crossed twice. 10 Sustrans routes, from the National Cycle Network 1 right the way through to 6 and 61 and the 136 down the Inglebraun Valley. 9 parks, ranging in size from Windsor Great Park to local country parks such as Hornchurch and Denham. 8 days of cycling, in which I covered nearly 500 kilometres with 3,400 metres of climb. Some days were definitely more physical than others. 7 cycle-friendly cafes from the Coalhouse Fort to Shoreham, and that's excluding all the pubs and other cafes along the route. 6 major woods and forests, diversely managed by the Forestry Commission, local authorities and regional bodies, such as Epping and Hainault, but also the Thames Chase. 5 viewpoints, mostly on the North Downs, although one surprisingly in Essex, looking out over the Thames estuary at One Tree Hill. 4 named off-road trails, some of them disused railways such as the Alban and Ebury Ways, others ancient trackways such as the Pilgrim's Way. 3 canal towpaths, primarily the Grand Union and the Lee Navigation, but also a short section on the Basingstoke Canal. And 2 passenger-only ferry crossings across the Thames, differing in scale according to the size of the river at their points. Which of course leads on to the one big idea. Whilst I'd been cycling the way myself to get away from pancreatic cancer, I did want to put something back in return for the enjoyment it had given me. One of the editorial guidelines for articles that I'd read had said that asking people to sponsor a cyclist for undertaking a long distance ride was a bit like asking a holiday maker to do a sponsored sunbathe. Whilst I might not go quite that far, I certainly couldn't ask friends to sponsor me for something I'd enjoyed doing. Instead, another friend suggested a different tack. I decided to write up the OysterWheel, firstly as a therapeutic blog, but then I started to document the days more formally. In the winter I started to look at spokes for the wheel, routes back into the centre of London from each of the nodal stations. These had the advantage of being both shorter and more suitable for less experienced cyclists, and hence I was able to write them up with visual maps and turn-by-turn directions and key points of interest that might attract a more gentle cycling public. Inspired by Lost Lanes, I've started to write up the wheel days as separate booklets, again with maps and the story of each ride together with directions. All of this I'm going to make freely available together with the GPX files on the OysterWheel website. What I hope is that people who enjoy the rides will make small donations to my pancreatic cancer fundraiser page. We'll see. The total currently stands at about £100. So in conclusion, what did I learn that would help anyone wanting to plan something similar? Well, firstly, the starting point has to be the National Cycle Network, which can give you a basic framework for a ride. You do have to be careful as to the style and the route, and certainly what's under wheel you won't know until you're actually there, but it gives you a basic start. If it's going to be a multi-day circuit of a city, then and you want to stay in a single location for the duration, then transport points are key. Try and find out what options are available, such as trains, and any constraints on time as to when you can use them. Look at the Open Cycle Map to find options to fill in some of the gaps using regional routes, although beware of dotted routes. They may not exist on the ground. The internet certainly can be a good tool to research local parks and forests, especially as permissive routes may not be marked on definitive maps. However, one of the more frustrating areas is local authority published resources. They're often out of date and inconsistent, and in some cases non-existent. When all else fails, then Bridleways off the Land Ranger maps may be an answer, but you won't find out what they're like on the ground without recommendations or by trying them out. Best to try on a summer's day with hard dry ground, as even national routes can be cut up badly in winter. Finally, have fun in whatever you're trying. Remember Conan Doyle's words, and go for a spin down the road and forget all your troubles, if only for a while. If you'd like to find out more about the OysterWheel, take a look at the website oysterwheel.wordpress.com, and thank you for watching.